Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 155. This has been a really whirlwind time of year as we prepare for International Nature Journaling Week, and I'm also preparing for the Samford and Surrounds Arts Trail and Open Studio, which is at the same time. Both events begin on the 1st of June. I'm opening my studio next month as part of the Creative Samford event, which happens every year. This is my first time participating, and it's something that I've really wanted to do for many years, so this feels like a really big thing. If you're a Brisbane local, I'd love to see you at the Open Studio. And in amongst all this preparation, I've also been interviewing some amazing guests for the podcast. I feel extremely lucky with this podcast that I get to spend my time getting to know really interesting people from all around the world who are passionate about nature and creativity. And sometimes I get the chance to chat with someone who I deeply admire and consider a guide or a mentor because of the way that they show up in the world. Today is a conversation like this, and it's with poet and author Jarod K. Anderson, who writes under the name The Crypto Naturalist. Our conversation wandered over lots of different terrain and was punctuated by Jarod reading poems that related to the things that came up. I'm really happy to share this one with you today. Let's listen. Jarod, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This is extra special for me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Thanks, Bethan. It's really nice to be here.
So, I have been following your work for a really long time, and I think your work touches me because it speaks to an awareness that I've had throughout my whole life, even when I was very young, which was this understanding that being human on this earth is just utterly improbable and unfathomable and strange and terrifying at times, and also beautiful and just a wondrous thing. And I think as we grow up, we forget this often. And I'm wondering, for you, is this awareness about being human, is this something that's always been with you from the beginning?
A bit. I think like most people, I have periods where, I grow distant from that understanding or that perspective of wonder, with sort of day-to-day pressures. And I struggle with mental health issues. But one of the nice things is that you can kind of intentionally cultivate that awareness of magic hiding in plain sight. And the older I get, I'm in my 40s now, the more I've started to understand that cultivating that awareness is a self-care practice, and a vital practice for my mental health as well, where if I feel too disconnected from that wonder you're talking about, of the reality of just being here and what we are physically and mentally and our connections to the natural world, and those things can start to grow a bit stale if we don't revisit them and spend time with them and kind of focus purposeful awareness, and also for me gratitude toward those bare facts of the world that are so amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've written about nature walks with your mum, spending time in trees as a child, and I'd love to hear more about your early experiences, the experiences that sort of shaped that affinity that you carry with nature.
Yeah, I mean, some of my earliest memories are I would do a daily nature walk with my mother. I was probably 5 in some of these early memories. And those memories are very important to me right now as a dad of a 4-year-old who's constantly wondering, like, I wonder if these will be part of your first memories. But so we lived in sort of a rural area in Ohio, and I just remember these daily walks where season to season. In the springtime around now, we'd go out and see the spring ephemerals, the flowers that would be there and blooming for a week and then gone again until the next spring. And here it's Mayapples and Trillium and Bloodroot, and it's just sort of that constant wonder of what's next and what we might see or what changes from day to day. And, you do that enough, you can almost feel kind of a cadence of breath or speech out in the natural world. And so that was just such a special, defining part of my childhood. And yeah, there was a huge, I don't know, couple 100-foot spreading maple tree near my childhood home. And my parents ended up starting to call it Jarod's tree because I just spent so much time in it. Even, it's funny, even into kind of, when my friends were starting to drive when I was 16 years old, it was still kind of there would be friends that would come at night and shout from the street to see if I was out in the woods or up in the tree. And I often enough would be. I mean, that was kind of a thing that it was before I could articulate why I think I was doing these things. It was just that I felt kind of a sense of peace and connection, and it's just been medicinal for me my whole life, where anxiety and depression and out in nature, I just sort of feel myself and my identity differently. And I understood that early on, even if I didn't have the words to describe it. And in terms of the poetry, that one's easy for me to recall because I had a very important teacher in the 5th grade when I was 10 named Miss Woolard. And behind the school, there was this huge forested hillside, and she loved poetry. And she would herd all of us 10-year-olds out there into the woods and say, okay, go sit someplace. Which now I'm like, I wonder about the legality of doing that now. But at the time, it was like she'd just scatter these 10-year-olds out into the woods, and that was part of our the practice of learning poetry. And I just fell in love with it instantly. So I think I've been writing nature poetry ever since.
Isn't it incredible that sometimes there's that person that unlocks it for us? That person, they might just have some words of encouragement at just the right time or guide us in the right way. And I love that you can identify where that poetry began.
Yeah, I mean, I always loved words, and I knew I loved words, and that sort of unlocked what else they were besides just a thing I collected like shiny rocks. Like, I liked having words, but then it was like, okay, but this is the magic you can do with the rocks. These are the rituals, and this is how you can turn them into something bigger. And she was cool too, because she, I think, came at it with a sense of playfulness. Where I think some people, I've talked to so many people who've sent me messages and said, hey, I don't like poetry, but I like your poetry.
Yeah.
And, you dig into some of those conversations and it's like, all right, well, you don't like poetry because you ran into somebody in school who treated poetry like something that needed to be interrogated.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it was an IQ test
or
something. And it's like, well, no wonder you don't like poetry.
Yeah, or some sort of elevated art form that puts you apart from others. But your poetry really grounds you. It speaks to the experience of being human, going back to that. And we are all going through this thing at the same time. And maybe that's it.
Yeah, I mean, and there have been classic poets that fell in love a little bit too much with the idea of poetry as being a special club that, you had to know the password to get into. And but for me, the fun of poetry, the magic of poetry is in communication. So, if you're not trying to communicate, why not just write it down and stick it in a desk drawer? Like, part of the fun is connecting with other people. So, I used to write kind of more dense academic poetry. That was sort of my background. I used to teach literature, and I went and did a master's in literature. And, now I kind of joke that what I write is belligerently accessible poetry, where, like, first and foremost, I want to tell you about a thing I'm thinking. And then, everything else is in service to that one goal, I think.
When you studied literature, was poetry part of the curriculum? Did you pick apart the mechanics of making a poem?
Yeah, but it never, you see, like I've spent so much time on that, on meter and rhyme scheme, and I can't recall hardly any of it because that was never what mattered to me. Like I would do it mechanically when I was obligated to, but like I always loved Shakespeare, but I never wanted to discuss, iambic pentameter. Like that was like, I love animals, but I didn't want to be a veterinarian because like it's like I don't want to take apart a poem in a certain way where it's like oftentimes deeper understanding can kind of contribute to appreciation of something. I believe that's true, but with poetry, there comes a point where you have to back up from the trees and see the forest and enjoy the musicality of it and let it sweep you away and let it, that tingle of recognition or that magic of the building blocks of language becoming a castle. That's the reason that, I'm in the classroom to talk about poetry. So I would do the mechanical stuff, the technical stuff, but that's not what sticks with me.
Yeah. What sticks with me about poetry, and your poetry speaking specifically, is that you express huge ideas, but in this tiny amount of words. And there's something you've said the word magic a few times just in our short conversation so far, and I think there's magic in that, in taking a very big idea and putting it in the smallest amount of words possible. And what comes to mind is those haiku poems from many centuries ago, where they can take something and just in those tiny handful of words change the way you think, or make you get tingles, like you said, or recognize something, or connect with someone. I think that's magic about that.
Yeah, I agree. And some people call it economy of language when you think about poetry, but I often visually think about a poem and think about all that white space and what all that white space is suggesting. All that blank space is like... is kind of meant to tell you, okay, we're leaving all of this blankness, these fields of snow, and then it's like you see one tree in the distance on a snowy hillside, and it's like that tree becomes, powerful. It grows in your perception and becomes such a focal point. Like all that blank space makes that language, the language you choose to put on the page, carry a lot of weight. I think that's such a cool aspect of it. Yeah. And it also means that, for me, I'll often start a poem with an idea, and I'll be easy on myself as to how many words I can use to communicate that idea at first. And then you have to start peeling away layers, and is this the most succinct way to say this? Or is this the most powerful way to say this? And there's a balance held between that aspect of poetry. And then if you lean into that too much, I feel like the poem can become kind of lifeless, or it can become a word problem. And so you also have to give yourself room to kind of dance and make music and still enjoy that playfulness in language. And remember that a poem isn't a thing about efficiency. It's just that the efficiency can amplify what you're trying to do in a poem.
Yeah, that's really an interesting distinction. I wonder about your process and whether you read... well, let me give some context. This week I've really been immersing myself in your poetry. I've got your books here. I was outside under the trees reading your poems, and the experience of being outside made it all the more wonderful. And then I, at another time, was reading inside, and I found it harder to focus. Maybe that's just because there was lots of things going on. But sure. I wonder about writing and reading poetry and whether that is done outside.
Sometimes. I'm starting to kind of develop it's not a philosophy that guides me. It's more like a philosophy in hindsight about my poetry, where I'm starting to see different camps of poetry emerging. And there is one kind of poetry where I wrote it out in the woods. I can give you an example if you'd like.
Yeah, please.
I'll read Clergy from the collection Love Notes from the Hollow Tree. Clergy. Vultures are holy creatures, tending the dead, bowing low, bared head, whispers to cold flesh, your old name is not your king, I rename you, everything. That's a poem I wrote in the woods watching a turkey vulture.
Yeah.
There are poems that kind of happen in pieces. There are poems that start as an idea and it has to grow over 6 months.
Yeah.
But then every once in a while, there's a poem like that where, it was autumn, and I think I was in some kind of ragged woods, and by the roadside, I saw, I think, a couple turkey vultures land, and there was a deer by the side of the road, a carcass. And, just watching them, they're so slow and sort of formal, but also there's something that feels caring and intelligent about them. And the word clergy, I think, came to me first, which is interesting because I don't come from any kind of religious background, and yet I love to use religious imagery sometimes when I talk about nature. And it's that feeling of holiness that
Yes.
I can tie to the feeling of magic, where when I search for words, sometimes the vocabulary is in, I find it and I borrow it from religion. But that's not true of all my poems. But for that poem, it was, I was struck with a moment, and then comes that feeling that I have to find a way to communicate this.
Do you carry a notebook with you?
Not always. I did that time.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, I go to the woods, I go to nature for different purposes. There are times, as somebody who struggles with major chronic depression, there are times when literally my wife will sort of say, hey, there's a look on your face and you need to go outside. And,
I love that.
Right.
I love that she recognizes that, and the balm and the way to combat that is that she knows to guide you outside.
Yeah, I mean, it's so helpful sometimes to have somebody outside your own brain to help you recognize patterns. Yeah, and she's right, and I'll sometimes even be begrudging about it. Like,
I'm going.
Yeah. And I'll make little deals with myself. Like, I'm going, but I'm only going for 10 minutes. Or I'm only going to walk to that tree, and then I'm going to go back to my car. But, of course, every time I actually, start walking down a path and I'm outside and somewhere beautiful and it starts to engage all my senses, then I get wrapped up in the walk, and it absolutely helps. Other times I will absolutely go to the woods with a notebook in hand, and I'm doing it intentionally, almost looking for, I don't know, the raw materials of creation, because I will sort of feel like I want to write poetry. And I'll sit at my desk and I'll look at a blank Microsoft Office document, and at some point it'll hit me like, well, this isn't where poetry lives necessarily. So sometimes I have to go to it.
You have written, and I think this is absolutely beautiful and pertinent to the themes of your work, but you say that you live in between a park and a cemetery. And I'd love for you to describe where you live, and this, I don't know, something about that really speaks to the themes of your work, the park and the cemetery, because, death comes into your work, but not just that, just the cycle of this human life and the way we go round and round.
The person who sold us this house, I remember, I think they were a little surprised by how enthusiastic we were about it. And the joke is quiet neighbors for a house next to a cemetery. And but yeah, we share a fence with a cemetery I think it's about 50 acres. But it's also an arboretum. And Boy Scout troops come and label tree species with little silver tags, and there are dozens of bluebird boxes there and tree swallow boxes, and People maintain them, and it's just, it feels so full of meaning to me that, cemeteries existed before parks, and often they are this anchor point of nature, surrounded by human construction and human activity. Mm. And then the question arises, why? Well, cemeteries seem to be an important part of a lot of people's sense of ritual and meaning and missing loved ones. And the idea that for that we choose to make a place that seems to be dedicated to nature always seems so weighty to me. Mm-hmm. And I see so many beautiful, quiet reflections and people kneeling and having moments with past loved ones. And simultaneously, I see bald eagles landing high in white pines, on their way between nearby lakes. And there's Cooper's hawks that raise families there, and the headstones are warm, so they do this behavior called loafing, where they spread out their wings and get real flat on top of the stones, and
to capture the warmth.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the place is, it's a museum of lichens and mosses, and it's just a cool place, and I walk there a lot. There's a group of crows that live there, and I always wish I could make friends with the cemetery crows, but I think they're too cool for me. They have their own stuff going on. They don't always pay any attention to when I try to offer them things, And then, across the street from me is another big kind of open park that it was a Civil War training camp. And so it has a historical marker plaque. But to me, what that means is that it's another area reserved for trees and wildlife. Yeah. And, they're eastern cottontail rabbits. And, I see red foxes out there sometimes. And I've seen coyotes here. And I'm not that far from Columbus, which is a medium to big sized city, and yet, I love that I found kind of a pocket of nature, and it's a constant reminder to me too that I don't necessarily have to buy a ticket to go see nature. Yes. I don't have to go to an old growth forest or there's so much nature inside and just outside my home, and growing in cracks in the sidewalk, and it's been a real treasure to live here.
I wonder because you have a poem and it's called Unlearning Death, and it really touches me. I lost my dad last year, and when he was alive, he used to come to this place where I live, and he made this beautiful native garden, a forest almost, and we put his ashes there. And I think regularly that, I don't know what happens. I don't have a religious background either. I don't have a sense of what's next, but I do know that all the parts that make our physical body get recycled. And you talk about this a lot, about the air you breathe is air that's being breathed by someone else, or the water that's in you is now in a cloud. That I love this, and that we put my dad's ashes in his garden, and he's quite literally nourishing the garden now, moves me a lot. I wonder if you'd read this poem, Unlearning Death.
Sure. What page is it on?
It's in the Field Guide to the Haunted Forest, page 71.
Unlearning Death. When we die, they may bury us or collect our ashes, but remember this: from baby teeth to skin cells and everything in between, most of the matter that has worn your name is already spread through the world. We bury our remains in the soil of our lifetimes. Can you feel it? So many of the cells that have formed the community of your body have returned to nature. Most of the water that has fueled your life has returned to the sea. The substance of your form is not fixed. It flows like a river to and from the wilderness. Moss doesn't think about being alive, and mountains don't consider themselves to be dead. Death has no place in the vocabulary of nature. To worry about death is to forget that we, the moss, and the mountains are all part of an undiminished whole that isn't measured in breaths.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I find comfort in that, about the idea that all this whole experience, in fact, that's another theme of your work, is that we're all just one big organism, really, that's sharing everything. Can you speak to that?
Why don't I quickly read a poem I think of as the sister poem to that poem, which is short, please. And it's naming the river. The water in your body is just visiting. It was a thunderstorm a week ago. It will be an ocean soon enough. Most of your cells come and go like morning dew. We are more weather pattern than stone monument. Sunlight on mist. Summer lightning. Your choices outweigh your substance.
Yeah, that's such a powerful idea, that we're more weather pattern than stone monument, that we're just flowing, really. And it because so much of life is about, or feels like we're sort of pushing through obstacles or getting through things, but with that idea that we're transient, we're ephemeral, our bodies are ephemeral. It gives comfort to me.
Well, and I think we can get very wrapped up in sort of anxiety about impermanence when we start to think of like our physical substance. But, our physical substance is so literally tied to everything around us in the world that came before and will come after. So that, the impermanence to me is like, it's the impermanence of notes in a song, or the breath in between singing. It's part of a cycle that we are deeply familiar with and deeply in love with when we really think about it. And then the part at the end of naming the river there, it's that then it's really our choices that carry so much weight when we talk about a human life, because our substance is kind of granted to us by so many benefactors that take care of us, everything from the sun to the water and oxygen created by phytoplankton and forests on the other side of the world, and all of those things, which are just basic facts. They aren't leaps of they aren't real leaps of imagination. They're just true. The only leap of imagination is taking time to kind of expose our emotions to those bare facts of what life is, so that those things stop being invisible. I feel like we learn these things kind of early on, and then sometimes they get pushed aside, or we put a check mark on that knowledge and move on. And that knowledge is so desperately vital to us in terms of thinking about the purpose of our existence and wrestling with impermanence and trying to really think what the point of our lives are and what we should value. It's part of this thing I'm constantly pushing against, where people feel so compartmentalized and cut off from nature through just the thinnest of contrivances, just wooden walls and a door. And
yes,
it's like you can't be cut off from nature. And there's this attitude that we're somehow alien visitors here, or this is just the patch of dirt where we happen to park our genius. And it's just so far from the truth. And I think it's a toxic way to think about it for a bunch of different reasons. And, I think it's time for this pendulum to kind of swing back and recenter us in what we are and who we are, and that we're part of the landscape, not just spending some time here.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's something I wanted to bring up with you. It is that people talk about rewilding or getting back to nature, and yet your poems speak to me of the fact that we have never been separate from nature. No matter what we can put walls around us and a computer screen in front, and yet we're still nature. We've never been
not nature. And the work and your poems remind us that it's all about just remembering that fact, not getting somewhere or going somewhere or doing something extra, just remembering.
Yeah. Yeah. And I receive messages a lot from people who tell me that for one reason or another, they can't get out and see nature. And so I really love to remind people that lichen on the sidewalk is nature, or, the tree you can touch on your walk to work is nature. And, every breath you take is nature, and, the beat of your heart and the nature of your blood, being red from iron from the mountains. And, it's just so easy to forget, because I think, we have a tendency, to devalue it culturally, and then as somebody who suffers from depression, it has a cost. It has a very real sort of physical cost for me, that helps me not to forget the worth of cultivating that wonder and connection.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk for a moment about the Crypto Naturalist podcast. So you have this amazing podcast, a fictional narrator speaking about fictional creatures, imaginary worlds. And you describe it as real love for fake nature, and it makes me smile every time I listen to it. It's a fantasy world. Talk a little about the podcast.
Sure. So I sort of had reached a point in, I was working in academia, and I was an administrator doing marketing and fundraising, and I was feeling kind of beaten down in general. And I knew that part of the problem was I didn't have enough creativity in my life. And this was before I really started publishing poetry online and getting back to writing seriously. But I thought, okay, well, there's no pressure. The internet, the tools we have make it so easy to put something out there. So it's like, all right, nobody is going to listen to this. So don't think about perfect. Just think about what is exactly what you want to do if you could do anything in the world. And I came upon the Crypto Naturalist from that assignment that I gave myself. And it was, I often like to say that even in terms of being an actual naturalist, that I'm an enthusiast, not an expert. And for that, I was like, all right, well, what if it was just enthusiasm and I took expertise out of the equation entirely? It's like, all right, well, what does that mean? It means that I make up all of the details of what I'm talking about. And it's partly because I loved sort of single voice nature documentaries while simultaneously loving science fiction and fantasy. Mm-hmm. So it made perfect sense to me to do kind of a loving single voice nature documentary about fantastical and fictional nature. And one of the things I love about it, the real love part there, the real love for fake nature, is it's kind of an exercise in going back to being a child, like revisiting that newcomer mentality, where I'm talking about creatures that don't exist and they're one of a kind, and the narrator is always stumbling upon creatures that have never been seen before. And I sometimes like to think of the whole thing as a metaphor for actual nature, like the kind of wonder and love I feel for very real creatures. But you can kind of bring people along to that feeling through fiction. It's one of those things of getting to the truth through falsehoods.
It's interesting. It reminded me, do you remember when the movie Avatar first came out, and they had all these like creatures that were blobbing about and things, fantastical things that were just amazing to people. And I remember seeing that and thinking, but that's just a variation on the crazy creatures that we have here. It's not, we forget to be amazed about the actual things. We can make up these things, but look at this. Look at this thing.
It's I've said it before, and somebody pointed out to me that a stand-up comedian, I forget who, also said it, but electric eels is one of my favorite examples.
Yes.
Like and my 4-year-old son, like sometimes he knows that we're pretending and we're making things up, and I feel like we were talking about electric eels once, and it was one of those moments where he had to stop and say, "Are you joking?"
Yeah.
And it's like, buddy, totally fair.
Yeah.
Totally fair question. That sounds made up. But the same's true for, blue whales
Yeah,
as being,
totally.
the biggest creature that we know of,
All sorts of crazy things in the sea. I have a friend who's a marine biologist, and she's just all about like being in wonder about the crazy creatures that are in the sea. In the sea, there's all sorts of things that you would blow your mind if someone created them. You wouldn't believe it, but they're real.
Yeah, immortal jellyfish.
Yeah.
I mean, what are they called? The sort of species of like sea slug that capture photosynthesizing cells, and so they're sort of part animal and part plant, and there's so many examples, and it's one of these things where we almost bias wonder against real things sometimes, so you can kind of get there through fiction. Also, that podcast, podcast is just my playground sometimes. Which I need,
The thing I love about that is that you invent these creatures, but I guess I'm thinking about fossils because my son is learning about fossils in school, and we read a statistic, and now I can't remember the statistic, but it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of living things that existed on the Earth through the billions of years that the Earth has been here have been preserved in the fossil record, and only a tiny percentage of those have been found and recorded by humans. And so there's just this infinite, unfathomable number of animals and creatures and living things that have existed that we can't imagine because they're so fantastical and they're gone. And the things that you create in the Crypto Naturalist could have existed somewhere.
Yeah, it's an interesting exercise too in the information age, making friends with the kind of limits of our knowledge and the things that are unknowable. Because sometimes I think like we want to know, and we want to know now, and we want the answer, and it's like that's not how the universe works. It's vast, and you're only going to surface level know a fraction of it. I mean, I always think looking out my window here, like any single tree I see out here could be a lifetime's worth of work, and I still wouldn't know the tree on a real intimate level. It's you have to take a moment and think, okay, that's awesome, because I'm small and finite, and what that means is that the wonder and discovery is inexhaustible. I was taking a geology workshop a couple weeks ago, just out in the woods here in Ohio, and we were looking at this wall that had eroded from a river that was going by, sort of a cliffside, and it was all shale. And the geology professor was kind of pointing out the layers of shale and saying that these layers formed, it was basically Ohio was sort of at the bottom of a tropical sea when the shale formed. And he was saying that each layer of shale represents about 18 years, the layers. And he said it's tied to sunspot activity. And that now, with the sunspot activity we have now, sort of layers of sediment at the bottom of the sea are on 11-year cycles. And I said, why does sunspot activity affect layers of sediment at the bottom of the ocean? And he just sort of very matter-of-factly said, we don't know. And I mean, this was a geology professor standing there telling us about the geology, and it's just like, oh, right. There are always kind of the places where we're over the edge of the map. And I love it. You know, I love that there are a bunch of unanswered questions out there for us with our big strange brains to wonder about. It's nourishing.
When you think about it, and this is something, as I said in the beginning, that this is something that I've dwelled on since I was a very young child. My mum didn't know what to do with me when I was a child because I had all these thoughts in my mind. She didn't know how to answer my questions, and I used to feel like being human was just so weird. And the more you dwell on it, the more weird it becomes, because I guess our brains aren't designed to dwell on that too much, but it's hilarious. We take it so seriously, but it's actually completely hilarious. Yeah.
I think it's a balance, because there are times I like to dwell on it, the sort of bizarre nature of our existence, and then there are times I almost sort of feel like scolding myself that just the idea that, like, we're not here to own the universe or to figure it out. Like, the universe, I like to say the universe is an event more than a place.
Yeah.
Like, it's an ongoing explosion. It's in constant flux. Like, it's a thing that did happen and is happening. So, like, reframing in that sense, it's like, okay, well, you can't put fences around things and figure it out and own things forever. But what you can do is experience it and try to experience it to its fullest. And, I think about, like, you go to a fireworks show, or you go to a huge mountain vista, and every once in a while you see somebody who's trying to look at it through their cell phone screen.
Yeah.
In the way of, like, well, I'm going to capture this. And it's like, you can't. You're not. This is one of those times to just be here. And I think that's the other end of that. I mean, I more than most people love to sit around and think about the unanswerable questions, I think. But then there are other times when it's just like, go outside and feel the sunlight on the back of your neck, and realize that that's the highest honor that this place can give, and that you've got it.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily more complicated than that.
Yeah, I love that. And you spoke about gratitude. I'd love to hear, to me, your words speak to just being in gratitude, being in this moment, and just saying, wow, yeah, thank you for this chance. I'd love to hear you speak about gratitude and how that interweaves with your experience of the world.
Yeah. There's a trick I used to do when I was younger, where if I was hot or cold, I would try to imagine myself in the other extreme. And so if I'm walking through the woods and it's very cold out and biting, and maybe I hiked out a little too far and now I have to make it back to my car and I'm shivering, and I will try to think of sort of the most humid, hot day I can imagine, and I will think of buzzing mosquitoes, and I'll try to put myself in that mindset until I can be grateful for the cold. And, it's too cold for biting insects. It's so cold that I'm not going to get a surprise spider web to the face as I'm walking through the woods. And, it's cold, but I can put on more layers. You can only take off so much when it's hot. And I just have found over the years that if I can find the footing to bring gratitude into the conversation, I don't look at it from like a moralistic standpoint. I look at it as a gift to myself. Like, I can feel more whole and complete and content if I can find the footing to bring gratitude, to bear. And always in retrospect, I also think that it, for me, is correct. Like, for any of the criticisms that you can lay at this world's feet, I mean, there's no reason it has to be this way, by which I mean there's no reason it has to take care of us and have breathable air and topsoil that grows crops and, plants that can turn sunlight and rain and minerals into carbohydrates. We can't do that. We don't have a single technology that can do that. I mean, there's so many aspects of this world and this universe that take care of us and are kind to us and, informed every kind of aspect of our physical and mental beings. And I'm happy to grumble about things sometimes, but then it's also true that, like, we owe everything good about our lives and our future and our hopes and even our imagination to the physical nature of this place, of this world, of this universe. And I think we leave behind that knowledge sort of at our peril or to our detriment.
Mm-hmm.
That returning to that and being grateful is good for us. And I think it's, I don't know, honest.
Mm.
It's making friends with a central truth. Otherwise, you just take all that stuff for granted. Well, okay, but that's sort of a purposeful turning your back on all of the ways that nature takes care of us. And I think that makes us smaller when we do that, when we forget to be grateful and really try to reach for gratitude.
Mm-mm. Absolutely. I was really affected by one of your blog posts, and it's titled Seeking Peace While the Work is Unfinished. And I've been wrestling with something very similar recently. Your blog post is about the idea of destructive and constructive mindsets, and meaning we need both. We need sometimes to have the destructive mindset to oppose injustice and to do the work and to get angry and to force change. And yet you need to find a balance between the constructive and feeling community and dwelling in hope, that sort of thing. And I find there's a lot of stuff going on in the world at the moment, and I have heard it said that if you're not opposing it, then you're complicit. And I find for myself as a highly sensitive person that when I do engage with some of the devastation that's going on in the world, it renders me completely incapable of functioning as a human and incapable of functioning as a mother, and I just literally descend into a crying mess. And that is not helpful to anybody, certainly not to my family, not to my son, but it's not helpful to the world that I engage with that tragedy and end up in that state. And your words really helped me, because it said, yes, we need to oppose injustice, and we need to nourish ourselves and sometimes dwell in hope. I wonder if you can speak about that.
Yeah. It's a thing I wrestle with as well. And so that blog post is, like many of the things I write, also a note to self.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a trap of all or nothing thinking, which I struggle with. And I think the sort of big we, struggle with, where either you're, purely, wholly, and completely dedicated to opposing injustice, or it doesn't count. And I think that's disingenuous in a lot of ways. One of the ways is that just on a purely honest, purely reasonable, objective level, you can't own global outcomes. So I end up thinking of any of the sort of global outcomes I want to influence as this towering boulder over the landscape. And so I think, okay, I could break my body on that boulder trying to shift the global outcome that I'm concerned about, trying to fight the injustice. Easily I could break my body against the boulder. But that won't move the boulder, and it will just take me out of the world. And then so it's all right, but what then is my obligation? Because turning away also feels wrong. And so for me, it's all right. The key to so many things that I've found in life is to do more than nothing. And so extending that giant boulder metaphor, for me, it's all right, you have to lay your hand against the boulder and push gently in the direction of your values. And you have to know that boulders like that have been shifted, but it's through a whole bunch of hands pushing in the same direction. And so you honor yourself as a part of nature that also deserves to feel whole and happy and content and hopeful, because of that constructive mindset. You know, they make movies about wars a lot more than they make movies about mothers struggling with all of the work it takes to be a mother. And that's such a misrepresentation of what the human struggle is. I mean, you know how much patience and love and kindness and work and just overwhelming labor it takes to take care of one human being.
Mm-hmm.
And there, there's over 8 billion of us. And so what really matters when you really look at what humanity is, isn't the big, all-consuming, all-or-nothing shows of force. It's the gentle pressure, and it's the daily work. And so the real power is in that constructive mindset. Mm-hmm. It's just that it doesn't seem as sexy in social media posts and action movies. And but there's I forget who said it, but there's a quote I like about revolutions where it's like, yeah, everybody wants to fight, but we need to feed people. Mm-hmm. And I used to research sort of in my background in English literature. We would talk about historic wars and times when everybody would go home, because if they didn't go home to harvest the crops, it didn't matter who won the war. They were all going to starve.
Yes.
And that hasn't changed that much. So, it's understanding that in nature and all things, there's an element of balance. And if you don't allow yourself time to be whole and happy and cultivate the things you need for hope, and to allow for the possibility that things will work out and all the thing that makes life worth living, then none of the other struggles matter. And that's just fundamentally true.
Jane Goodall has pivoted, and she has a podcast now, Hopecast, and it's all about that. It's about that we need hope to keep going, and I think that that's what you're speaking about. I wonder if you could read the poem that's called Many Hands. It's on page 21 of this book.
Sure.
And I think it's related.
Many hands. The world will always be troubled. This is true. You deserve to feel happy and comfortable. This is also true. If you feel the first truth undermines the second, I offer this. Own a share of the virtuous work toward solutions. Don't burden yourself with global outcomes. The good and the evil are happening concurrently. The choice to focus on the good is itself a way to defy the evil.
It's a powerful one.
It's a big world, and individually we are small. And so if you think you're going to take in all of the evil in the world and carry it as your burden, you're wrong. You're not going to. There are too many worthy fights in the world for you to own them all simultaneously, or for you to even equitably, say there's some objective measure of how much effort and time and energy each of them deserve from you. You can't partition out. You're not that big. Nobody is. So, we really do have to choose to do something and then reject the idea that we can or should do everything. And then once you own that central truth, it's like, all right, so what have I created room for? Well, you've created room for the things that make life worth fighting for. It's the things that, it's the good things in your life that make the troubling things so terrible. Because we love life and the world and nature and each other and all of the facets of human caring and endeavor and creativity and beauty, that's why the things that seem in opposition to those aspects are such an affront. But you gotta you got to maintain your garden at home. You can't just always be out and away fighting, to protect the garden. If nobody's there to take care of it, nobody's there to take care of it.
Yeah, I really feel like nature journaling for me and many of my listeners is something that we can use to nourish ourselves, to keep going with that. I don't like the word fight, but to keep going with that important work. But we need to remind ourselves this is what it's all about, that there's beauty here, that there's love here, that there's things to be grateful for, and just returning to that on a cycle, like you said, is important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the world runs on seasons, and I think we do too. And acknowledging that is so helpful when we reject the idea of being perfect or that we have it all figured out. I have a related poem about that, if I could read it. This is, so I mentioned earlier sort of having different classes of poetry. This is one where I observe something in nature and then think about how that something I've observed relates to my own life or struggles. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes I do the opposite, where I have a struggle in my life and I kind of take it to nature and see what nature has to say about it. But this poem's called Forsythia. As Forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is Forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It is not an age for towers. It's an age for stubborn flowers.
Stubborn flowers is such a beautiful metaphor, such a beautiful thing to think about. Yeah, it goes on. Yeah. Nature goes on.
And they exist. And that poem started because I was mad at them. Because Forsythia aren't native to my region of the world, and somebody planted a bunch of them in the backyard of this house before I bought it. And I started to get very kind of bent out of shape for sort of like I'm a naturalist. I write nature poetry. I can't allow any non-native plants to be in this back garden. And, one day I went out there with this huge pickaxe, and it took me, I don't know, an hour and a half, and I was just drenched in sweat and dirty afterwards. And I finally got one of the 12 bushes down. And, I ended up with this sort of splintery, stony hole. And I'm just kind of sitting there out of breath looking around. And then I think it was a house finch came and landed on another Forsythia and just was kind of bobbing there up and down looking at me. And I was just thinking, and at the time I was really struggling with major depression, and it was just one of those moments of this is what I'm sweating over, the purity of my backyard. And it was just one of those moments where it's oh, I'm doing the all or nothing thinking thing. And it's silly. I'm, to a certain extent, I'm being silly. And there was a lesson there in the nature of Forsythia for me, which is so hard to remove because it's so resilient. And I started to think about okay, maybe I can take a breath on this kind of rigid purity thinking about the landscape outside my house. And, I'm going to plant more native plants, but maybe I don't need to turn the backyard into rubble all at once in order to do this thing. Yeah. So it was one of those moments where it's I need to press gently against this boulder. I'm not moving it by banging my head against it. And so it was one of those moments of sitting out in nature, even in my own backyard, and thinking, oh, okay, this is a teachable moment where I feel like the landscape's trying to tell me something.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'd love to talk about your new book, and it's coming out. I've got it on pre-order. I'm very excited to see it. It's a little different. It's called Something in the Woods Loves You, and it's a bit of a memoir, and I won't speak about it. You speak about it.
Sure. It is. Yeah, it's a memoir. It's sort of. I have it here.
Oh, you have it. Is it out already?
No.
Okay.
But I have an early copy. Yeah. It comes out on September 10th.
Okay.
And it's a long literary memoir.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of full of poetry because I'm me and I can't help it. But it's really kind of a narrative of reaching a low point in my depression and coming back to nature, realizing that it was missing from my life, and then journeying back to it, and then kind of having the realization that this has happened many times. So the book is really kind of about the role nature has been playing in my life since I was a little kid, and there are sort of flashbacks involved, but it is coming to terms with depression as an illness, and then figuring out how nature ties into my identity and ties into my efforts to journey toward wellness. And the book is broken into 4 seasons, and each season has the chapter headings are all titled with a plant or animal that means something to me, and how that animal has played a role in my life or has taught me something in the way that the Forsythia story has taught me something. And it's something I've been wanting to do for a long time, partly because I get a lot of messages from people who see me writing about nature and depression and then want to reach out and talk to me about their own mental health struggles and talk shop, as I think of it sometimes, on strategies for navigating all of our complicated brain issues. And so I had said to my wife, Leslie, a couple of years ago that there's just this long conversation I want to have with everybody, where it's not necessarily that I have it all figured out, but I do feel like I have some things figured out. And it's that magic in writing where it's like I want to connect with people. I want to have the long conversation about nature and mental health and nature and philosophy and nature and magic. And so that's what this book is. It's me having that long conversation. And I felt very lucky. A publisher I respected, Timber Press, reached out to me. And I knew they had published Doug Tallamy, who writes about oak trees and has so many books I love, and so I was a little bit starstruck that they were talking to me. And the acquisition editor said, "Hey, have you ever thought about writing a nonfiction book?" And I said, "Funny you should say that." I had an outline, and I had written the first few chapters because it was a book that I was determined to make happen, whether or not I could find a traditional publisher for it. So yeah, I'm very proud of it. It's I don't think I've ever cried so much writing a book, which was interesting. And I'm talking to the publisher, and they're going to have me come in to work on recording the audiobook, and I'm a little bit anxious about there are some of these sentences that I'm going to need a running start at. Because it's such an emotional undertaking to really unpack and analyze kind of my relationship with nature and my relationship with my own mind. But I'm very proud of it, and I'm very excited about it coming out into the world.
Congratulations. I can't wait to read it. One of the things that I really love about the way you speak about depression and nature is that you don't say, head outside and you'll be cured. It's more like, head outside and this thing that's gripping you that feels like it's all consuming is going to transform into something different.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very careful never to be the guy who's like, yeah, go touch a tree, you'll feel better. Like,
Yeah,
nope.
yeah.
It does not work that way.
Yeah.
But the thing that I find so interesting and so helpful and hopeful is that going out in nature does change it for me. Maybe differently on different days, but I feel sort of like a different person sometimes when I'm alone out under the trees, where it's like, you know, I think in family groups and in work and even with friends, we can sometimes fall into these like roles that we play, or you know, almost just different hats we wear. Out alone, kind of under the trees, it's like, all right, well, there's nobody I'm supposed to be out here. You know, I can be out there and kind of feel myself as an animal, sort of feel myself as a citizen of nature, a part of this place, you know. And that kind of makes space for me to think about my mental health differently, where it's not, I got to get it together, I have a presentation, or I don't want to make my friends uncomfortable. You know, do I look upset? Or, you know, do I seem normal? Or, you know, all of the weird games we play with ourselves as we interact with other humans. And it's kind of like, all right, I almost feel a muscle I didn't know was tense, relaxing sometimes when I'm out in nature. And that just makes space for me to really kind of have a conversation with myself about sadness or anxiety, or any of the stresses that are weighing on me. It's a way to almost step back from myself sometimes.
You've spoken. Sorry, go on.
That just feels Well, it just feels powerful. Yeah.
I was going to say, you've spoken about how there's depression and then there's shame about depression, and often shame about depression, and that's completely linked with other people and how we're thought of and how we're seen and how we present ourselves in the world. And often shame about depression is worse than depression itself.
Yeah, because, you know, it becomes sort of a danger when it's bad enough to be sad or to be anxious or to feel hurt. But then if you start to kind of bring your identity to bear, and it's like, well, the problem is me. And, you know, we understand the world through stories so reflexively, and in the media we consume. And it's like, well, who's the bad guy in this story? All right, well, it's like you look back and forth, and it's like, well, there's nobody here but me. And so the danger is sort of becoming the villain of your own story. And then it's like you have to carry the burden of the pain. And then at the same time, it's like, and it's my fault. Or there's something, why can't I just think my way through this? Or, you know, it can be as bad as the pain, but it is also a roadblock to seeking help.
Yes.
Because if you let shame come into the equation, it's I'm hurt, but I don't deserve help.
Yes. And a big theme also in your poems is about loving ourselves as much as we love nature, because we're going back to it. We are nature, and we find it easy to love what's out there, but less easy to love what's here, our body, ourselves, our minds, the things we go with, the things we struggle with.
Yeah.
Turning that love inward is its own work, but it's so powerful. And I love the poems that speak about that. Well, I have a poem here that is kind of, it's the idea of me having an internal issue and taking it to nature. Maybe I could read that. Please do.
This is from the collection Leaf Litter, and the poem is called Leaf Litter. Today is a hard one. I'm failing to shower, to eat, to do anything. I feel the weight of what's beneath my bed, the untuned mandolin, the knotted jump rope, the worksheets from therapy, the books I almost read. I picture a dumbbell, a skiff's shattered hull on a dust bunny seabed. All these things were once me, discarded but for their hunger for my space and thoughts. What are they now? My depression says, defeats, red ink on the permanent record, a dragon's hoard of wasted hours. But I see the woods beyond my window, and they say something different. Leaf litter on the forest floor, slowly becoming soil, does not represent the failure of past summer's trees. It is the process by which the past nourishes the present and future. The same is true for my old selves, my bygone passions, last season's interests. Maybe I can't shower today, but I can sense a choice, a fork in the path. I will choose the trees. I will be thankful for the leaf litter, and, with an eye toward new green shoots, will await a shift in the weather.
Yeah, that's so gentle. Gentleness with ourselves, I think, is something that's much, much needed.
Well, part of rejecting the go touch a tree and you'll feel better too is I love the phrase leaf litter.
Yeah.
Because it recognizes what in nature appears to be a mess. Nature's full of messes, but those messes have purpose.
Yes.
Those messes are doing work that you can't see. And so somebody who, will have a bad mental health day, I try to allow myself that kindness that, of course, I'm going to have internal messes. Messes are sort of a fundamental part of how cycles and seasons and magic in nature work. So why wouldn't I allow for messes in my own life?
Mm-mm. Oh, I have some questions from Patreon, from podcast listeners who support the show on Patreon. And one of the benefits of being a patron of the show is that you have the chance to offer up questions to my guests ahead of time. And I have a couple of questions for you from listeners, if that's okay.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Karina would like to know about your process and what motivates your creation. She says, do you create mostly for other nature lovers, or do you hope to draw others into more nature appreciation through your work, or is it that you just create without thinking about your audience?
I think, honestly, I probably create for me first, because often a poem will feel like, I'm generalizing because there are poems that come to me in a flash, like the vulture poem.
Yeah.
But generally what I have is either an idea I want to communicate, a piece of language I think is fun or powerful, and I want it to be a poem. Or sort of a question or problem I'm working out for myself, kind of like the leaf litter poem.
Mm-mm.
Like, what do all these past selves and passion mean, and how can I twist them around into something that feels kind of healthy and natural? So, a poem that gets written usually is something that keeps tapping me on the shoulder. Either that scrap of language or something I want to communicate or something I want to articulate. And so it starts with that. It starts as that question of craft and that challenge. And then once it gets close, I get excited about connecting with an audience.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I'm not writing necessarily for nature lovers. I really, in a perfect world, if I have to choose between those two, want to bring people into nature. People who feel like they either don't have permission to access nature, or they don't have the tools, or I got a message once from somebody who told me that they wanted to go for walks in the woods, but they wouldn't know what they were seeing.
Yeah, interesting.
And that was kind of heartbreaking to me. It's like, you don't need to know anything.
Yeah, just go out and be amazed.
Yeah, you understand that all names are made up, right?
Yeah.
Like, just Go touch things and watch things and feel good about it. And then if the impulse takes you, learn learn things, but you don't have to start with that. So yeah, in a perfect world, I want to connect people to nature, but it usually starts as a question to myself.
It's interesting to me because you have built a very large following on social media, different platforms, and there's all this sort of, people say social media is this or that, or it takes us out of the world, it takes us, and it can do that, certainly, but it's also a place to connect with other people who feel the same way. And I've had a very powerful experience of making lifelong friends on social media and connecting with people in different ways, that is in just very powerful shared experiences. And it sounds like you're doing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are times I have to realize I'm doom scrolling or something and really need to get off social media. But I live on a little one-way street next to a cemetery. I mean, nobody would have ever read my writing, probably, if not for social media. So it's hard for me not to see immense value in that. Yeah.
I have another question. This is from Linda, and it's about wonder. Wonder is a word that's used a lot when we're talking about nature journaling. It's a very powerful experience, and I know that it's very much a part of your experience. And Linda asks, what was the wonder in nature that helped you discover its healing power?
So, I could... That answer would probably change year to year, but there's a reason there's a great blue heron on the cover of my memoir. And that was, when I was really deep into depression and struggling with suicidal ideation and in a job I didn't like, I took a purposeful walk in nature for the first time in years. And I came to like a bend in a river, and I saw a great blue heron waiting there, and it was just one of those sort of pivotal turning point kind of moments where it's like, wow, here's just this living fossil and this wonder of the natural world, and this thing that I'm just seeing out under the sky. And I could be seeing it now, I could have seen it 50,000 years ago, and there was just this sort of monumental shift where you get too focused on your own life and sometimes your own pain, and you can step outside and see something like that. And I had this thought of, it's all still here. I went away, nature didn't go away. And so after that experience, every time I see a blue heron, I sort of feel connected back to that moment.
That's lovely. I would love to read this little poem. This is a poem that I shared with my son. It's yours, and I'll just read it now. It's very short. It says, I have to assume that in the fullness of time, at least once, a mouse has used a mushroom as an umbrella. This is enough to keep me going. I love this, and it's about delight. It's about delight in this world, and my son just thought it was so lovely. And tell me about delight.
Delight and whimsy are both things I think are just super undervalued.
Yes.
And I feel like I, as a teenager, maybe earlier, I think I was taught to be suspicious of delight and whimsy, and that they were somehow frivolous, or distractions. And I got older, I matured, and I came to realize, like, oh no, those are absolutely important building blocks of a good life. Being silly. It's one of the main things I will tell people who are like, I want to get into writing poetry. Where should I start? And it's like, be silly.
Yeah.
Allow yourself to remember that language is fun. Yeah. And, there have been studies where we learn things if we can learn something through play, we learn it at such a deeper and faster level than through like classroom instruction.
Yes.
So bringing play into your life wherever you can, I think is worthy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It has been a delight. It's been so great and an honor to have you here. Thank you again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. I could talk about this stuff forever.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jarod. His poetry just captures so much, and it packages thoughts that are hard to express and helps me to hold complex feelings about this world and what it is to be alive. And I think that being able to reflect our experience like this in poetry is a really special gift. Please do go to the show notes where you'll find links to Jarod's website and social media. His poetry books are available now, and his memoir, Something in the Woods Loves You, is available for pre-order. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.